All right, we'll move on to conduct of business. And as I've said the last number of weeks, despite what a lot of people have said, we're still open for business. The lights are on, the doors are open, and we have some regular business to conduct, and we'll start it this evening. Item 10A, receive a report and provide direction related to an expedited planning process for homes affected by the Glenview fire. Mr. Aknin.
Thank you, and good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council. As the Council knows, the Glenview fire destroyed homes within the Crestmore 2 subdivision. And before I go into the expedited planning and building process, I want to touch on just the historical background in this area. So it was developed between 1956 and 1964, and the majority of the homes in the area were originally constructed with 3 or 4 bedrooms as well as 2 bathrooms. And compared to many other subdivisions that were built earlier in San Bruno, these homes are on the larger side. In terms of living area, most of the homes, and on average, have about 1,600 square feet of living area as well as a 2-car garage. There are some homes that have been added onto over the years that are slightly larger. There are also, what's interesting about this neighborhood, at least from a planning perspective, there's a lot of things that planners refer to as legal non-conforming. That means that they were built legally before today's codes. One of those issues is 3-foot setbacks that many of the garages have, as well as many smaller garages. As the Council knows, several months ago, we adopted residential design guidelines. And the primary purpose of these residential design guidelines were to set the expectations for people building onto their homes, which will ultimately lead to a shorter review time and a shorter process, as people will come into their applications with acceptable applications and there'll be less back and forth. That said, for larger homes, there's a 2-step process that they have to go to before they go to the Architectural Review Committee. And the first step is an Architectural Review Committee meeting where the Architectural Review Committee, which is a subset of the Planning Commission, provide initial feedback on applications. And that usually occurs within the 2nd to 3rd month after receiving architectural application. Following the Architectural Review Committee meeting, there is a Planning Commission meeting where an ultimate decision is being made. And once it's approved, it moves on to the structural review phase, which takes about another 2 months. There's a lot of back and forth within this process, less back and forth now that we have the architectural review guidelines, but these are complex plans that architects are drawing up, so they do take some time for architects to actually draw the details, and that's why it takes a longer time. With that in mind, even though the process has been shortened with the architectural review process, in the spirit of wanting to rebuild this neighborhood quickly, we're now presenting different ways in which we could expedite this planning process. For the sake of background, too, the reasons why homes might have to go through the Architectural Review and Planning Commission meetings is if they exceed a 0.55 floor area ratio. What that means is if you have on your average 5,000 square foot lot, if you build more than 2,750 square feet, you would have to go through this process. Same with there's a lot coverage guideline. There's several other guidelines that relate to parking and windows and decks. We prepared a report, and I put another table in front of you that shows 3 different likely scenarios of people wishing to rebuild their homes and a potential expedited permit process for each one of those. The first one would be the first scenario, and this would probably just be, after talking to people in the neighborhood, this would just probably be a handful of people, if that. And that's that they want to build exactly or a very similar home to what they had before. The home would be similar in scale, similar in height and square footage. There would be some cases in which this home may have non-conforming aspects. For instance, they may have a 3-foot setback on the garage that they wish to rebuild. Normally, or they may have been approved for larger square footages by the Planning Commission. I know there's three homes in the neighborhood that have been approved for larger homes within the past decade, so they may have square footage that exceeds the guidelines. And the potential review process that we show here, as long as they're proposing a home that's similar in scale, they would just have to submit for a building permit, not have to re-go through that Architectural Review and Planning Commission process. This would take a process that would take normally 4 to 6 months if they had exceptions, and take it down to about 1 to 2 months. And this, of course, depends on the complexity of the plans and whether the architect is able to respond to the city comments. But what we are showing in this is instead of the normal time where it would take 2 to 3 weeks to respond to structural and architectural comments, we'll cut that down to 1 week or maybe 2 weeks. The second scenario, which I think is going to be the most likely scenario for a majority of the homes, is that they would propose brand new homes, new architectural styles, but they would meet all the development regulations, because the homes are pretty big in this area, and if you look at the homes that have been built recently in San Bruno, they're generally under that 2,750 square feet. So in this circumstance, it would be the same thing. It would take about 1 to 2 months. The architect would submit to the building and planning department at the same time. The structural review would be done at the same time as the planning review, and we'd get that back and get that plan reviewed quickly. And there's actually no exceptions under this scenario from our current code. Other than that, they would meet the residential design guidelines, which is the newer portion of our code. And the third scenario, which will probably be some of the homes, that they want to exceed some of the floor area ratios. Perhaps they want to build a 3,100 square foot home on a lot that has a max of 2,750 square feet. Normally, this would be a 2 to 3 month planning review process, so they would have to go to the architectural review committee meeting, followed by the planning commission. What we're proposing in this is that they would go straight to the architectural review committee meeting, followed by the planning commission. And this would take a process that normally takes 5 to 7 months, about cut it in half to 2 to 3 months. So those are some of the potential expediting scenarios. I think that, looking back, I've been with the city for 8 years, being involved with this process, and I think there's really two overall intents of this process. A is to create homes that might be large but are still compatible with the neighborhood that surrounds it, and that was further gotten into with the residential design guidelines. And the second was just to let the neighborhood let them know what's going on with the process. So that's why we have a public review process for these homes. What we propose to do under this scenario for the homes that do exceed the thresholds, we wouldn't have the standard mail notices 300 square feet, 300-foot radius around the homes. Rather, we would contact the most immediate neighbors, post all the elevations on our website, and allow feedback through our website and allow people to comment on those and take those comments into consideration when they're being considered by the Architectural Review Committee meeting. And finally, as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, there is open space in this area. And as we begin this rebuilding process, one thing that we are going to want to outreach to the community on, is something that we're working on, is some type of community visioning process for this open space area within the neighborhood. So with that, I could take any questions from the City Council.
Any questions?
Through the chair.
Mr. Rivera?
Aaron, you've got in the staff report, you have an itemized list of all the affected properties and pre-existing living areas, square footages. How accurate is this information, and what's it based on?
It's based on one of two things, primarily based on county records. So the county records has the existing living area that's listed, that's being assessed, and then we added for 2-car garages, we added on 400 square feet. Other homes that have added on more recently, we've had the square footage numbers straight from our building permit records.
Okay, and it appears that there's maybe less than 10% of those that have had improvements and expansion in the last, that were existing.
Correct. Yeah, I would say, there was 3 large expansions that have happened, and then, several other people have bumped out extra family rooms and things like that, but nothing that needed to go to the planning commission.
And I know this is probably a little too technical, but it's something that crossed my mind, is that once we've gone through and we've cleared the sites, and if you're talking about replacing a structure in generally the same spot, what's left? I mean, were all the foundations gone, taken out? I mean, so there's been a lot of excavation, and so we are down to some,
Correct. All the
soil.
foundations, when they're subjected to that heat, no longer have their structural integrity. So those foundations were all removed. So things like surveys are going to have to be done for the individual lots, as well as geotechnical investigations for each one of the lots, since the foundations were moved and some of the homes are built on a partial fill.
And then as far as utilities, I know there's a part in the report as far as the sewers. Are we starting from scratch on a lot of these utility connections, gas, water, and are we even going to consider maybe underground utilities for electrical?
Yeah, all the utilities for the individual homes that were destroyed will be starting from scratch in terms of where it starts from the sidewalk to their home. There's underground utilities. We haven't touched on that issue before, but that's something that we could talk about later.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Through the chair,
Vice Mayor?
Real quick, just if you could, I know we have the design guidelines in place, which is probably helpful, but I know there's been some questions about what we envision as far as size, how we compare that as an example to another subdivision that's come before the Planning Commission. Is there any idea you can give us on what we might be seeing?
I would say, judging on what's been demanded in the market, I mean, if you look at projects like Summerhill and some of the homes that have been selling recently, I think that you'll see homes that are somewhere in the 2,000 to 2,400 square foot range. That seems to be the market demand right now, as well as something that's slightly bigger than some of the homes that were out there for more modern conveniences, larger kitchens, larger family rooms, and aspects like that. But I don't see too many of the homes approaching that 3,000 mark or that 3,200 mark that we saw a lot of homes approach back in 2004 and 2005. People have seemed to get slightly smaller homes than they were proposing 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Okay. Ken?
Just quickly, has there been any inquiries? I mean, what sort of feedback have you been giving?
It's actually surprising, and it's actually encouraging how many people are wanting to build and wanting to build quickly. Over the last week, I'm getting calls from 2, 3, 4 property owners a day that are asking, what's the process going to be? A lot of the architects, we've reached out to the AIA and forwarded the residential design guidelines, so a lot of the architects are getting familiar with those guidelines. So there's a number of people that want to rebuild once they're hiring architects now and hiring contractors now.
Real quick, I'm sorry, one thing. With this suggestion that you have before us, would it be safe to say to anybody out there that would be the objective and the goal to try to make the timeline cut in half by this process?
Roughly that's correct. I mean, you're taking what's usually a 6-7 month process when you're asking for exceptions, and you're consolidating it down to a 2-3 month process. Typically, when we take 2 to 3 weeks to review structural plans, to provide comments, we're going to cut that down to a week or maybe 2 weeks. Yeah, and that's of course starting from the time that we actually receive a submittal from the architect. And it does take time for architects to create plans because you're building a home that's going to be there for at least a half a century.
Thank you.
Now, what do you need from us tonight? You just want direction and that you're going in the right direction?
Correct. So what will happen if we are going in the right direction, quickly we'll make whatever zoning ordinance amendments that have to be made in order to expedite this process. We'll do it in something called an overlay fashion, which basically says that particular ordinance only applies to a certain amount of homes that we specify. And then we'll go forward from there and have a first and second reading.
Okay.
If I could, one last comment. In the spirit of expediting things, I think there should still be, or at least in your department or in your position, some way to extend the review period, because knowing the area fairly well, I know that there's a stretch of homes that were all one story, and the rebuild could conceivably include some 2 stories, or larger homes, or at least different volumes. That may cause some issues with some of the neighbors. So as far as a change, a big visual change. So I would strongly suggest that you really, knowing that there are some houses that were originally 1 story, the ones that become 2 story, we really do some outreach to those immediate neighbors and the ones that are going to view it, in a different light.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Through the chair.
Yes, Irene?
Thank you. Aaron, once we do this tonight and you come back with the zoning thing, how long from that point does it take to put this in effect?
It's my understanding it's 30 days from the second reading that it'll be taken into effect. What we'll do in the meantime is start processing those applications that people submit, so we can provide feedback and get them on the agenda, and then they'll be approved within a shorter time frame once the ordinance is actually passed.
City Manager?
You're actually probably not going to have any downtime, because people are just now beginning to get their architects on board. As Aaron indicated, you have 2, maybe 3 months for architects to develop the drawings. We will be amending the code in that time period, and so I wouldn't really anticipate any real delay for residents who are ready now to start the process. And again, they'd start by hiring an architect and starting to work on their design concept.
Good.
And what we've also done is, we've asked architects to come in early in the process. So in this 2 to 3 month period, as the ordinances are coming online, we can meet with them and, review initial plans that they have and get their application ready to go, so it goes as quickly as possible after that.
Okay. I believe you have your direction.
Thank you.
All right.